The village of St. Mildred's on the hill lay beneath a soft December hush, the sort that came only with snow promised but not yet fallen. Frost silvered the hedgerows and lingered upon the stone walls like fine lace. Chimneys breathed thin plumes of smoke into a pale morning sky, and from the green, where a modest Christmas tree had been erected by the Women's Institute, came the faint scent of pine mingled with coal fire and damp earth. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her dove, grey wool coat and a scarf of faded rose, paused at her cottage gate and surveyed the scene with gentle approval. There was, she reflected, something particularly revealing about villages at Christmas time. People were thrown together more than usual. Old grievances had a way of surfacing beneath forced goodwill, and generosity often walked arm in arm with envy. It was, in her experience, a season ripe for trouble, though few would admit it. She adjusted her gloves and began the short walk towards St. Mildred's Chapel, a small, ancient building perched on the rise above the village. The chapel was not the parish church. That honour belonged to St. Luke's down the lane, but a far older structure, Norman in origin, no longer regularly used except for special services. At Christmas, however, it came alive once more, candle-lit and fragrant with holly, drawing villagers with a fondness for tradition and a taste for nostalgia. This year's Christmas Eve carol service promised to be particularly well attended. There had been, for weeks now, a certain air of excitement, tinged with unease. The chapel had acquired a reputation, quite undeserved in Miss Marple's view, though she never discounted the power of suggestion as being haunted. Whispers circulated of strange echoes after dark, cold draughts where no windows stood open, and, most compelling of all, a shadow seen moving near the altar late one evening. Nonsense, of course, Miss Marple murmured to herself. But nonsense has a way of encouraging people to behave very foolishly indeed. The chapel and its caretaker, the caretaker of the chapel, was Mr. Basil Hawthorne, a man of 50, with a narrow face, iron, grey hair, and a manner that suggested permanent disapproval of the modern world. He lived alone in a small tied cottage nearby, and took his duties with grave seriousness. It was Basil Hawthorne, in fact, who had first mentioned the disturbances, though whether from genuine concern or a desire for attention was a matter Miss Marple had not yet decided. "I tell you, Miss Marple," he had said only 2 days before, when she encountered him arranging evergreen boughs by the chapel door, "there are things in that building that ought not to be disturbed." "You mean draughts and acoustics, I expect," Miss Marple replied mildly. Hawthorne had sniffed. "You can mock, but I've locked that place every night these 20 years. I know it sounds—" Miss Marple had smiled, a small, knowing smile, and said nothing further. The manor and its household overlooking the village stood Greystone Manor, a sprawling, somewhat melancholy house of honey, coloured stone. It belonged to Sir Lionel Mortimer, a retired colonial administrator whose stiff bearing and clipped speech betrayed long habits of command. Sir Lionel was not universally liked in St. Mildred's, though he was respected, and his patronage had funded much of the chapel's recent restoration. Sir Lionel's household was, at present, a crowded one. There was Mrs. Edith Mortimer, his second wife, considerably younger than her husband, with an air of fragile elegance and a fondness for dramatic size. There was Clara Mortimer, Sir Lionel's niece, a brisk, intelligent woman in her early 30s, who acted as her uncle's secretary and managed the manor's affairs with a competence that some found intimidating. And there was Jonathan Reeves, a distant cousin and struggling artist, invited for Christmas out of a sense of obligation and, perhaps, pity. Additionally, the manor employed Mrs. Winifred Pollock, the housekeeper, an efficient woman with sharp eyes and a remarkable memory for other people's business, and Thomas Pollock, her nephew, who assisted with the heavier tasks and harboured ambitions that clearly extended beyond polishing silver. It was widely known, because Mrs. Pollock ensured it, that Sir Lionel intended to announce something important at Christmas. Whether it concerned the manor, the chapel, or his will was a matter of energetic speculation. Christmas Eve, on Christmas Eve, the village gathered at the chapel just as dusk settled, candles flickering like stars against the stone walls. Miss Marple took her place near the middle, nodding pleasantly to acquaintances. She observed, as she always did, the small details others overlooked. Mrs. Edith Mortimer arrived late, cheeks flushed, eyes darting nervously towards her husband. Sir Lionel himself sat stiffly in the front pew, jaw set, his expression unreadable. Clara Mortimer leaned close to him, murmuring something that caused his brow to furrow. Jonathan Reeves lingered near the back, sketchbook under his arm, glancing about as though hoping, or fearing, to be noticed. Basil Hawthorne stood by the door, hands clasped tightly, his gaze flicking repeatedly towards the shadowed corners of the chapel. The service began. Carols rose and fell, familiar and comforting. The chapel glowed with warmth, yet Miss Marple felt, inexplicably, a faint chill creep along her spine. Not fear, exactly, rather the sharpened awareness that had served her well in the past. Midway through the service, during a reading from the Gospel of Luke, there came a sudden sound. A sharp crack echoed through the chapel, followed by a dull thud. For a heartbeat no one moved. Then there were gasps, murmurs, and finally a cry. Sir Lionel Mortimer had collapsed forward in his pew. The aftermath chaos followed with astonishing speed. Someone screamed. Someone else dropped a candle, which was hastily stamped out. Mrs. Edith rushed forward, calling her husband's name, while Clara stood frozen, her face drained of colour. Miss Marple did not move at once. She had learned over a lifetime that it was often better to watch than to rush. Dr. Arthur Bennet, the village physician, was present, and he pushed his way through the crowd with admirable efficiency. He knelt beside Sir Lionel, checked for a pulse, listened for breath. After a moment that seemed to stretch unbearably long, he rose. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "Sir Lionel is dead." A hush fell, broken only by Mrs. Edith's soft sobbing. The official cause, announced later that evening, was heart failure. Sir Lionel had, it emerged, suffered from a weak heart, though he had kept the matter private. The stress of the service, the cold, perhaps even excitement, all were offered as explanations. And yet Miss Marple, sipping a cup of tea offered by a trembling Mrs. Pollock in the Manor's drawing-room, was not convinced. For she had seen, just before Sir Lionel fell, a curious thing indeed, Clara Mortimer leaning towards her uncle, her hand raised as though to steady him, or to do something else entirely. And she had noticed Basil Hawthorne at the back of the chapel, staring not at Sir Lionel, but at the altar, his expression one of sudden, acute fear. Most telling of all, she had heard, not the crack of a pew, as many supposed, but something sharper, more decisive. A sound she associated from past unhappy experiences with a glass vial breaking. Accidents, Miss Marple reflected later, as she prepared for bed, are very often assisted by human nature. Outside, the chapel stood dark and silent against the winter sky. Its ancient stones held their secrets close, and somewhere in St. Mildred's, on the hill, a murderer was counting on Christmas goodwill to cloud the truth. Christmas morning dawned clear and brittle, the frost lying thick upon the village green like a sheet of spun sugar. Church bells rang as usual from St. Luke's, their sound steady and reassuring, though for many in St. Mildred's. On the hill, reassurance was precisely what they lacked. Sir Lionel Mortimer's death had cast a long shadow over the festivities, and even the most determined optimists found their cheer subdued. Miss Marple, seated at her small oak table, with a neatly buttered slice of toast and a pot of tea at precisely the correct strength, read the Downshire Gazette with thoughtful attention. The headline was modest: "Sudden Death at Christmas Service." The report was factual, cautious, and, she suspected, carefully edited after a conversation with the local constable. Heart failure, she murmured. Yes, that's what they always say at first. She folded the paper and rose, tying on her coat. There were visits to be paid. In a village, grief and guilt alike had a tendency to talk, particularly when given tea. A visit to Greystone Manor wore mourning badly. Black crape hung discreetly by the front door, but inside the house felt restless, as though the furniture itself were uneasy. Mrs. Winifred Pollock ushered Miss Marple into the drawing-room with a nod that conveyed both respect and keen curiosity. "Mrs. Mortimer is not receiving," she said, "but Miss Clara will see you." Clara Mortimer entered moments later, brisk as ever, though her eyes were rimmed with fatigue. She greeted Miss Marple with polite restraint. "I understand you were present last night," Clara said, seating herself opposite. "It was all very shocking." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Such things often are." Clara's lips tightened. The doctor was quite clear. "My uncle had a weak heart." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Still, I hope you will forgive an old woman's curiosity. I thought perhaps you might tell me how Sir Lionel had been in recent days." Clara hesitated, then spoke carefully. "He was preoccupied. There were matters concerning the chapel restoration, and, of course, family arrangements." "Oh," said Miss Marple, "Christmas brings such matters to the fore, doesn't it?" Clara met her gaze directly. "If you are implying—" "Oh no, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "I imply nothing. I merely observe." There was a pause. Then Clara sighed. "My uncle intended to make an announcement on Christmas Day," she admitted. "A change to his will." Miss Marple nodded, as though she had expected no less. "And who stood to benefit?" Clara smiled thinly. "That would depend on whom you ask. Mrs. Edith Mortimer." Miss Marple next encountered Mrs. Edith Mortimer in the smaller morning-room, where she lay upon a chaise longue, attended by a strong cup of tea and an air of delicate suffering. "I can't imagine why people keep asking me questions," Edith said faintly. "It's all so distressing." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, "but one does like to understand." Edith dabbed at her eyes. "Lionel was devoted to the chapel. He spent so much time there lately. Sometimes I hardly saw him." "And did that trouble you?" Miss Marple asked. Edith hesitated. "Well, it's lonely being a second wife. One never quite belongs." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, thinking of many such women she had known. "And money matters can be unsettling." Edith stiffened. "I have no idea what you mean. Forgive me," Miss Marple said softly. "I only wondered whether Sir Lionel had made provision for you." Edith looked away. "He intended to, but Clara had her own ideas. That was interesting, very interesting indeed. Basil Hawthorne speaks later that afternoon." Miss Marple walked up the hill to the caretaker's cottage. Basil Hawthorne opened the door with evident reluctance. "I suppose they'll close the chapel now," he said bitterly, before she had spoken a word. "Say it's cursed." "Villages love a curse," Miss Marple replied. "It gives them something to talk about." Hawthorne glanced nervously over his shoulder. "You didn't hear it, did you, the sound just before he fell?" "I did," Miss Marple said, "and I should very much like to know what you think it was." Hawthorne swallowed. "There's an old cupboard in the vestry. People don't know about it. Sir Lionel did. He insisted on keeping certain items there." "What sort of items?" Hawthorne hesitated. "Documents and a small box, locked. And last night—" "The box was gone this morning," Hawthorne said hoarsely. Miss Marple felt a small thrill of certainty. Then perhaps the chapel is not haunted after all. Jonathan Reeves and the artist's eye. Jonathan Reeves was found in the village inn, nursing a glass of sherry and sketching idly on a scrap of paper. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his expression wary. "You're Miss Marple," he said. "Everyone says you notice things." "Only small things," she replied, "often overlooked." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Like how my cousin's death has made me a suspect." "I should be very surprised if it hadn't." Miss Marple said cheerfully, "You were not close to Sir Lionel." Jonathan shrugged. "He tolerated me. He intended to cut my allowance." "And how do you feel about that?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "It would have ruined me. Artists," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "are often underestimated, but desperation can be very motivating." Jonathan looked away, guilt or anger flickering across his face. "The doctor's doubts, Doctor. Bennet received Miss Marple in his surgery, his manner grave. I certified heart failure. He said bluntly, 'But I would welcome a post-mortem.' Something troubles you?" Miss Marple asked. There was a faint scent, he admitted, bitter almonds. Miss Marple nodded, not at all surprised. "And poison? It's possible," he said, "but without evidence." "Evidence," Miss Marple said, "has a habit of turning up." Village whispers by evening. Miss Marple had heard enough. The village buzzed with speculation. Edith's tears, Clara's efficiency, Jonathan's debts, Basil's superstition. Each suspect carried a burden of motive, and each had opportunity. Yet as Miss Marple sat by her fire that night, knitting steadily, her thoughts returned not to the people, but to the chapel itself, the vestry cupboard, the missing box, and the sound of breaking glass. Christmas, she reflected, is a time when people hide many things, presents, resentments, and sometimes the truth. Outside, a bell tolled the hour, and somewhere on the hill, St. Mildred's Chapel waited patiently for its secrets to be uncovered. The days between Christmas and New Year possess a peculiar quality in English villages. Time seems to pause, as though the year itself were drawing breath before moving on. In St. Mildred's on the hill, however, that pause was filled with speculation, half-truths, and an undercurrent of fear that refused to settle. Miss Marple observed it all from her usual vantage points: the post-office queue, the pew at St. Luke's, the small round table in the corner of the Blue Boar Inn. People spoke more freely now. Their initial shock dulled into something sharper and more personal. "Mark my words, Mrs. Griggs declared loudly at the post-office, "There's been something wrong with that chapel ever since Sir Lionel started poking about." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Old buildings do have ways of revealing things," she said, "just not always in the way one expects. The missing box, it was Clara Mortimer who formally reported the disappearance of the box from the vestry cupboard. The constable, Percy Lyle, a conscientious young man with a fondness for rule-books, made notes and frowned. It contained family papers, Clara said crisply, legal documents, anything of value. Constable Lyle asked. Clara hesitated a fraction of a second too long. Sentimental value, certainly. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, took note. Sentimental value was very often code for something else entirely. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another visit to the chapel, accompanied this time by Basil Hawthorne, who unlocked the heavy door with shaking hands. "I don't like being in here alone now," he admitted. "Most people don't like being alone with their thoughts," Miss Marple replied. The vestry cupboard was small and unremarkable. Inside, shelves bore the dust, marks of recently moved objects. "And the box?" Miss Marple asked. "Here," Hawthorne said, pointing, "no bigger than a Bible, metal with a clasp." Miss Marple knelt, examining the floor. There, almost invisible against the stone, was a faint scuff mark leading away from the cupboard. "Someone was in a hurry," she murmured. Edith's alibi rumour had it that Mrs. Edith Mortimer had been alone in the Manor's conservatory at the time of Sir Lionel's collapse. When Miss Marple gently inquired, Edith clutched her shawl closer. "I felt faint," she said, "the candles, the heat. I stepped outside for air. During the service, Miss Marple asked, yes, Edith said too quickly. I returned just as it happened." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Of course, later, Mrs. Pollock was less guarded. She wasn't in the conservatory. The housekeeper said, lowering her voice, she was in the west corridor, and she was arguing with Sir Lionel earlier that evening. About money, Miss Marple suggested." Mrs. Pollock's lips thinned. "About security, an interesting choice of word. Jonathan's sketch, Jonathan Reeves, in a moment of misplaced confidence, showed Miss Marple one of his sketches. "I draw when I'm nervous," he explained. This was from Christmas Eve. The drawing depicted the interior of the chapel, soft lines, careful shading, but Miss Marple's attention was caught by a small detail near the altar, a shadowy figure half concealed by a pillar. "You didn't mention this before," she said gently. Jonathan stiffened. "I thought it was nothing. Just Hawthorne, perhaps, or someone else." Miss Marple said, "Someone who didn't wish to be seen." Jonathan swallowed. "If I'd spoken sooner, they think that anyway," Miss Marple said kindly. "The poison theory, Doctor. Bennett's suspicions gained traction when the preliminary toxicology report arrived. It was inconclusive, but suggestive. Traces consistent with cyanide," he told Miss Marple in a low voice, but small, possibly masked. "In wine?" Miss Marple asked. "In communion wine, perhaps." The doctor replied. The implication rippled through the village. The idea that a sacred ritual had been tainted disturbed even the most hardened gossip. Basil Hawthorne was outraged. "I prepare that wine myself, always have, indeed," Miss Marple said, "which means you know exactly where it is kept." Hawthorne flushed. "You don't think, I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone else also knew." A false confession tension reached its peak when Thomas Pollock was found late one evening near the chapel, clutching a small bottle and in a state of visible distress. Confronted by Constable Lyle, he broke down. "I didn't mean to," he sobbed. "I just wanted the money." The bottle, however, proved to contain nothing more sinister than cheap brandy. Under questioning, Thomas admitted to stealing small items from the manor, but knew nothing of Sir Lionel's death. "A red herring," Miss Marple murmured. "Quite a vivid one." Miss Marple reflects that night. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting with renewed concentration. Her mind moved not in straight lines, but in patterns, like the stitches beneath her fingers. Edith's fear, Jonathan's desperation, Basil's secrets, Clara's efficiency, and above all, the chapel, its vestry cupboard, its missing box, its reputation for ghosts. People invent hauntings. Miss Marple thought, when they wish to frighten others away, or when they wish to hide something in plain sight. She laid her knitting aside and smiled faintly. "I believe," she said aloud to the empty room, "that the truth is hiding behind a very old superstition." Outside, a wind rose, rattling the bare branches around St. Mildred's Chapel. Somewhere within its ancient walls, the past stirred, ready, at last, to be brought into the light. The new year arrived with a thin fall of snow that softened the outlines of St. Mildred's on the hill, muting colours and sounds alike. To Miss Marple it lent the village an air of careful concealment, as though nature itself were urging discretion. Yet concealment, she knew, was never permanent. It merely delayed the inevitable. She had reached the point in many investigations where the pieces lay scattered before her, each apparently unrelated yet forming, when viewed correctly, a single coherent pattern. The difficulty was not in seeing the truth, but in persuading others to see it too, and for that one needed timing. A return to the chapel. Miss Marple requested that the chapel be opened once more, ostensibly so she might collect a forgotten scarf from Christmas Eve. Basil Hawthorne accompanied her, his face pale, his manner tense. "I don't like this," he muttered as the heavy door creaked open. After what's happened, Miss Marple said pleasantly. It's more important than ever. The chapel was cold now, stripped of its festive warmth. Evergreen boughs had wilted, candles burned low. The altar stood bare and severe. Miss Marple walked slowly, her sensible shoes echoing faintly on the stone floor. She paused at the vestry cupboard. "Tell me, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "how long has this cupboard been here?" "Centuries," he replied, "older than the pews." "And how many people know of its existence?" Hawthorne hesitated. "Sir Lionel did, Miss Clara, and well, I suppose anyone who'd taken an interest in the building plans." "Plans?" Miss Marple echoed softly. She bent down and ran her fingers along the lower edge of the cupboard. There, beneath the dust, was a tiny dark stain. "Wine," Hawthorne suggested. "Possibly," Miss Marple said, "or something that looks very like it." She straightened, her eyes sharp. "Tell me, where is the communion wine kept?" "In the vestry," Hawthorne replied automatically. Then he stopped. It was Clara Mortimer's efficiency. Miss Marple paid a call on Clara Mortimer later that afternoon. Clara was in the study, surrounded by papers, her expression brisk as ever. "You've been very busy," Miss Marple observed. "There's a great deal to manage," Clara replied. "My uncle left matters in a state of transition." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "transitions can be dangerous times." Clara's eyes flicked up. "What do you mean?" "Only that people are often tempted to hurry things along." Miss Marple glanced at the desk. Among the neatly stacked documents lay a familiar-looking metal clasp. "Ah," she said lightly, "you found the box." Clara stiffened. "Yes, it was returned anonymously." "How fortunate," Miss Marple replied. "And the contents?" Clara hesitated. "Family papers?" "Such as," Miss Marple prompted gently, "a revised will." There was a long pause. "My uncle intended to leave Greystone Manor to the chapel," Clara said finally. "As a trust. Edith was to receive a modest allowance. Jonathan, nothing at all. And you?" Miss Marple asked. "I was to remain as trustee," Clara said quietly, with full control. Miss Marple nodded. "That would have displeased several people." "It displeased me," Clara said sharply. "He was being manipulated." "By whom?" Miss Marple asked. Clara said nothing. Edith's fear misses. Edith Mortimer was easier to read. Miss Marple found her pacing the drawing-room, twisting her handkerchief. "They're all watching me," Edith whispered. "They think I did it." "Do they?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "Or do you think they do?" Edith collapsed into a chair. "Lionel frightened me. He said I'd be left with nothing, that I'd have to manage on my own." "And that worried you?" Miss Marple said. "Yes." Edith said miserably, "But I would never, never." Miss Marple patted her hand. "No, my dear, I don't believe you would." She studied Edith thoughtfully. "But you were afraid. Afraid enough to argue. Afraid enough for someone else to notice." Edith looked up sharply. "Someone else. Fear," Miss Marple said, "is very useful to certain sorts of people." The sound of breaking glass. Miss Marple's thoughts returned again and again to that sound. Not the crack of wood, not the fall of a man. Glass. She invited Dr. Bennet to tea. If cyanide were administered, she said, it would need to be masked. Something bitter, something sharp. Wine, doctor. Bennet agreed. Or brandy. And a vial, Miss Marple said, small, easily concealed, and broken afterward. The doctor added slowly, to destroy evidence. Precisely, Miss Marple said. The ghost in the chapel, the so-called haunting, now took on a new significance. Reports of shadows, noises, cold draughts, all had occurred after Sir Lionel began storing documents in the vestry. Someone wanted the chapel avoided. Miss Marple concluded, and succeeded. Jonathan Reeve's sketch confirmed it. A figure lurking by the pillar, half hidden. Miss Marple summoned Constable Lyle. "I believe," she said gently, "that the haunting was a performance. The gathering, at Miss Marple's suggestion, the principal parties were invited to Greystone Manor under the pretext of discussing the chapel's future. Sir Lionel's patronage, after all, had left many questions unanswered. They gathered in the drawing-room, Clara composed but pale, Edith trembling, Jonathan restless, Basil Hawthorne stiff with apprehension, Mrs. Pollock watchful, and Constable Lisle notebook in hand. Miss Marple sat quietly, hands folded. Sir Lionel did not die of natural causes. She began calmly. He was poisoned. A murmur rippled through the room. The poison was administered via the communion wine. Miss Marple continued, decanted beforehand, using a small glass vial. When Sir Lionel drank, the effect was swift. Clara spoke sharply. "This is speculation." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Then perhaps you will explain why the communion wine was moved from its usual place." All eyes turned to Clara. I authorized it," she said, "for safe-keeping." "And the vial?" Miss Marple pressed. "The one broken in the vestry." Silence. "You see," Miss Marple said gently, "Sir Lionel was about to announce something that evening, something that threatened control, not money alone, but authority." She looked directly at Clara. "You feared his decision. You knew the chapel, its cupboards, its acoustics. You staged a haunting to keep others away, and when that was not enough, you used the very sanctity of the service to conceal your act." Clara's face drained of colour. "I only meant to frighten him," she whispered, "to make him change his mind. But poison frightens very effectively." Miss Marple said softly. Constable Lisle stepped forward. Truth exposed, Clara Mortimer broke down at last, confessing in halting tones. The will, the trust, the fear of losing everything she had worked for, the opportunity presented by the chapel and its myths. "I never meant to kill him," she sobbed. "But you did," Miss Marple said gently. And Christmas is a very unforgiving witness. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the village in white. Inside, the truth lay exposed at last, stark and unavoidable. And Miss Marple, watching quietly as Clara was led away, reflected, as she so often did, that human nature, far more than ghosts, was the most reliable source of hauntings there ever had been. In the weeks that followed Clara Mortimer's arrest, St. Mildred's on the hill slowly returned to itself, much as a pond settles after a stone has been thrown. The ripples lingered, of course. Villages never forgot entirely, but they softened with time, smoothing into stories told over teacups rather than whispered behind hands. Snow fell again in earnest, blanketing the lanes and hedgerows in a clean, forgiving white. Miss Marple, watching from her sitting-room window as Mrs. Bantry from the next village navigated the icy pavement with heroic determination, reflected that nature had a way of offering absolution even when human beings could not. The aftermath at Greystone Manor stood quieter now, its windows darkened earlier in the evening, its halls echoing less with purposeful footsteps. Mrs. Edith Mortimer remained there for the time being, her movements subdued, her voice softened by shock and grief. Miss Marple paid her a final visit, bringing with her a small tin of shortbread. "I don't know how to begin again," Edith said, twisting the edge of her shawl. "Everything I thought was solid has vanished. Beginnings," Miss Marple replied gently, "are often disguised as endings. One just needs to look carefully." Edith managed a faint smile. "They say Clara planned everything, that she used my fears, my arguments with Lionel, as part of a scheme. Fear is a powerful tool," Miss Marple said, "but it does not make you responsible for another person's choices." Edith looked relieved. "The allowance Lionel promised, it will still stand." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "Sir Lionel's earlier will remains valid. The trust arrangement was never legally executed." Edith exhaled slowly, as though releasing a burden she had carried far too long. "And the chapel?" she asked hesitantly. Miss Marple smiled. "Ah, the chapel will endure. It always has. Basil Hawthorne and the chapel Basil Hawthorne was found one cold afternoon carefully polishing the brass candlesticks at St. Mildred's Chapel, his manner more subdued than Miss Marple had ever known it. "I never imagined," he said gruffly, "that someone would use the place for something so wicked. Places," Miss Marple replied, "are neither wicked nor virtuous. People merely borrow them." Hawthorne nodded slowly. "I suppose the haunting stories didn't help." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but they were very cleverly encouraged." He frowned. "I'll see to it that the vestry is secured properly from now on. No secrets tucked away." "A wise course," Miss Marple said. "Secrets have a habit of echoing." On Epiphany the chapel reopened for a small service. The congregation was modest, but the candles burned steadily, and no shadows stirred beyond the ordinary play of light. The ghost, it seemed, had finally been laid to rest. Jonathan Reeves finds his way. Jonathan Reeves surprised everyone by announcing his departure for London. Miss Marple encountered him at the station, where he stood with a single battered suitcase and his sketchbook tucked under his arm. "I thought I ought to leave," he said. "Too many memories." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested kindly, "just enough." He smiled ruefully. "I've been offered a position illustrating for a small publisher. Nothing grand, but honest. That," Miss Marple said, "is quite grand enough." Jonathan hesitated. "You never really suspected me, did you?" Miss Marple considered. "I suspected you of being unhappy," she said, "which is not the same thing at all." As the train pulled away, she reflected that young men often mistook frustration for villainy, and were equally surprised when they discovered it could be transformed into purpose. Constable Lyle learns a lesson. Constable Percy Lyle, notebook still immaculate, visited Miss Marple one morning bearing a small parcel. "A thank you," he said awkwardly, from the station. Inside was a new teacup, decorated with forget-me-nots. "You've taught me something," Lyle admitted, "about listening." "Yes," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "facts are very useful, but people are far more informative." He nodded solemnly and took his leave, resolved, Miss Marple suspected, to observe his village with rather more attention than before. Miss Marple reflects life in St. Mildred's. On the hill resumed its familiar rhythms. Knitting circles reconvened. The blue boar's fire crackled as warmly as ever. Gossip gradually shifted to safer topics. Whose goose had burned? Whose daughter had received an engagement ring just before New Year? Yet Miss Marple knew that something fundamental had changed. One afternoon she walked up the hill to the chapel alone. The door was unlocked, the interior still and cold. She sat in a pew halfway down, hands folded, and allowed her thoughts to drift. Sir Lionel Mortimer had believed he could control the future through careful arrangements. Clara Mortimer had believed she could improve upon them. Both had underestimated the stubborn unpredictability of human nature. Christmas, Miss Marple reflected, has a way of exposing what people value most and what they fear losing. She glanced towards the altar, where candles flickered gently. "There are no haunted chapels," she murmured. "Only haunted consciences." Epilogue. A quiet Christmas remembered the following Christmas found St. Mildred's Chapel filled once more, though the service was simpler, the decorations more restrained. Miss Marple attended as always, sitting in her customary place. As the final carol faded and the congregation rose, she felt, not triumph, but a quiet contentment. Justice, such as it was, had been served. The village had been spared further harm, and the truth, however uncomfortable, had been acknowledged. Outside, snow began to fall softly, each flake settling without sound. Miss Marple drew her coat closer and smiled to herself. Christmas, she knew, would come again, and with it human folly, human kindness, and occasionally human wickedness. She would be ready.